Well guys, we're back. As you can see, a lot has happened since the previous step. I did quite a few things off camera that are really not unique to this helicopter. It's stuff like centering the servos, building the links, leveling the swash, setting zero pitch. I've done all of that. The basic head setup is done. None of that is unique to this helicopter. You can go find your flybar list of choice setup video and follow along for those steps. So I saved, just didn't have to keep the video a little shorter. Did all that off camera. Pretty straightforward. The links on these gaps are set in the manual. You got 20 millimeter gap here, 23.5 millimeter gap there. Level the swash. I am a big advocate of keeping the servo linkage the identical lengths. So I keep all three identical with my caliper, and then level the swash with some sub trim in the flybar list. That will, if everything's done properly, if these are all equal and the swash is level, then your horns are all going to be 90. It's pretty straightforward. The next thing we've got to do is we need to finish the linkage for the tail, which is this guy right here, goes right here. Like everything else in the head, this is going to get a lot of red Loctite. I'm going to red Loctite both of these pivot balls, and then I'm going to use blue Loctite on the looks like an M3x10 that goes through the axle, and then there's two 2.5 M2.5x6s that actually mount this plate to the side frame. I'm going to go ahead and stop the camera, Loctite all this, get this mounted, and then when we get back we'll be talking about building the tail rod control linkage. Alright, as you can see, I've now got my rear tail, I guess for all intents and purposes it's a linkage piece, belt crank, pivot point, whatever you want to call it. One thing to point out, this piece is not symmetrical. When you are mounting this, and it's depicted in the manual, but when you're mounting this, the ball that is physically lower goes on the outside of the frame, so that lines up with the ball on the servo on all the way in the front, and then the arm that is higher goes inside the frame, so it tucks up closer to the boom. It's pretty straightforward. It is outlined in the manual. I want to make sure you pay attention to that. Be careful not to get Loctite on the threads of this pivot point. As you can see, that is tight, no play, and it moves freely. That is not going to add any restrictions and add any mechanical bind to your tail linkage. Alright, so I'm going to set this guy aside. We're done with that for right now. Next thing we've got to do is start talking about the tail and the various pieces of carbon that come with this kit. For the tail, you've got 2 carbon boom supports, a carbon tail control rod rear, and a carbon tail control rod front. The 2 carbon control rods use these metal control rod ends that need to be epoxied on to each end. And then the tail boom supports have plastic boom support ends that need to be epoxied on. Now, this part is really hard to do on camera, so I'm not even going to bother to try, but I'm going to talk you through it real fast. I have tried many different approaches to gluing on these boom support ends and getting them square. It never fails, one's always slightly off. So what I have found that works 100% of the time is actually epoxy them on the helicopter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-fit the boom, slide my boom clamp on, get the bolts for the front and rear of the boom supports pre-threaded in the boom support ends, mix up my epoxy, scuff the ends of this carbon well, give it the epoxy someplace to bind to. Sometimes the seals on these carbon can be slippery. And then I'm going to actually apply the epoxy and immediately bolt the support end to the helicopter in its permanent location. Let everything cure in the right orientation. It's simple, it's easy. I really don't remember where I learned that from. Someplace on Heli Freak, I think. It might have been Tony Whiteside. Not sure, but it's a great tip. I've done it for several years now for a lot of builds. It works great. But because the boom, adding the boom to the frame makes it very large and bulky, it's hard to do on camera. So once it's cured, I will take the control rods back off, the boom support rods back off rather, and show you what they look like finished. But it's really hard to get the whole helicopter, at least a helicopter this size, in one frame. So I'm not going to try. Another tip I have learned over the years when dealing with these control rod ends is I actually take a piece of duct tape. Now this I know I got from Tony Whiteside. And I will tear off some strips of duct tape. Set that down on my working surface. Again, have my epoxy mixed up and ready to go. Scuff these control rod ends, put the epoxy in, and then I will just set that guy right down on there, fold the duct tape up, seal it, and the duct tape will hold these ends with positive pressure on them, so that as the epoxy cures, they don't tend to walk off the end. It's genius, it's simple. Again, I credit Tony Whiteside for that tip. I don't remember how long ago it was I saw him post that, but it's perfect, it's easy, and I'm all for easy. So I'm gonna stop the camera. Got a little work to do off camera. When I come back, we'll have some epoxies done. Alright, let's get you guys caught up a little bit. Off camera, I went ahead and built the skids. These are pretty straightforward. You've got 2 skid tubes, 2 skid struts, 4 skid tube protective caps, and 4 M3, rather, those might be M4 set screws. This is pretty straightforward. The tubes have holes. You slide the tubes into the skids and you line the hole up with the set screw. Run the set screw in. I put a little drop of CA on top, just helps keep it from backing out. But I can always break the CA free later if I need to. This takes all of like 2 seconds to build. I didn't do it on camera. I apologize. If anybody has any questions or any troubles with their skids, please send me a message. Leave it in the comments. I will happily address it. I hate it when I get into a mood, a groove like that, and forget to film stuff, so I apologize. But there's the skids. The next thing, as promised, I have epoxied my boom supports and my carburetor control rods. They are curing. I use a fast set long cure epoxy, so it's workable in about 5 to 10 minutes, which is about what it's been, about 10 minutes, and then it's fully cured in about 12 hours. So this helicopter has 0 chance of flying in the next 12 hours, so it will be fully cured and ready to go. But because it sets in 5 to 10 minutes, it's totally workable now. I can pull it off the helicopter, set them to the side, and go on building the next step. These control rod ends, they've been curing about 5 minutes now. I'm going to give them a couple more minutes before I pull the tape off of those. While I wait for those to cure, I'm going to set my helicopter frame over out of the way. Let's talk about the torque tube. Now the torque tube on this guy is pretty straightforward. Now it's a relatively short boom and torque tube, so there's only one torque tube bearing, but you still got to be careful when you put this thing on the torque tube. You do not want to center the bearing. I like to leave it a little bit off center so that the length on this side and this side are not equal distant. It just eliminates the amplification of any harmonic vibration. So I know there's a lot of guys have different theories on how to attach the torque tube bearings to the torque tube. I just use a medium gap closing CA. Loctite works well. It just takes forever to set up, and I don't like being held up. CA, if you're careful, you use a thick CA so it doesn't run everywhere. CA works really good, so that's what I'm going to do there. The torque tube ends, however, I'm going to talk about those real quick. These guys were first introduced with the 766, and this style has carried over to the new model since there's a version of this now available for all the torque tube models, and then it carried over into the N556. So what we have found is while the shops that make these torque tubes are really good about making sure the OD is to spec and even, they're less careful about the ID. And what we found was when we had the old torque tube ends that went inside the torque tube, the thickness of the walls varied, and sometimes you'd have this torque tube in there and it wouldn't be true to center. But if by going to this type of torque tube end that captures the torque tube, we're getting much truer runs on the torque tube ends. So that was the reason we did that. It's pretty straightforward. It goes over top, and there's a 11 millimeter pin that goes through there and captures it. And then you've got this Delrin cap that slides on from the back and holds the pin in place. Now you want to be careful when you're assembling these. This first one I'm going to do, I haven't put the torque tube on so I can slide the cap on all the way down the other end. But when I go to do the other one, I got to put this cap on first and then the torque tube end, because I won't be able to get the cap past the other torque tube end or the torque tube bearing to capture the pin. I personally, I don't try to reuse these torque tube ends in a crash. If the torque tube bends, they're gone anyway. So I'm going to put a little green Loctite on this and the pin, and use the cap as really just a retainer. The green Loctite's going to hold the work, do the most of the work. The reason I do that is over time, similar to the pin on the auto rotation gear, load, unload, load, unload, load, unload, load, unload. That pin can slowly begin to erode the hole a little bit. The green Loctite keeps it all locked up and tight, and you're never going to develop play in the torque tube. So again, your preference. It's certainly not required. You can always CA this cap on and call it a day, but I prefer to lock it all up with green Loctite. I'm going to go ahead and stop the camera, finish building my torque tube, check my torque tube control rod ends, and when we get back, hopefully the tail boom is done. Alright guys, quick update. All of the pieces that required epoxy are done. The clutch stack and the engine have had ample time to cure. I went ahead and bolted on the skids. It's 4 3 by 10 millimeter, maybe 3 by 12 millimeter bolts. Nothing special there. I told you in the beginning I wasn't going to make you watch me tighten every bolt, but the skids just bolt onto the bottom piece of cake. At this point, everything is Loctited. The shroud's Loctite, the motor mount's Loctite, the base plate's Loctite, the clutch is Loctited. This guy is final assemble mainframe. The next thing to do is to just put the linkages on and do some head setup. I'm not going to record the actual head setup for you. Like I said earlier in this video, you can find your favorite flybarless systems teammate who's done a video for setup on that. Setup is very similar, one helicopter to another. The next thing for us to do though is to get the head set up, get the governor set up, get the tail linkage pre-made, and then this guy's ready, pretty much ready to bolt the tailbone. The plumbing for the engine I will do just before I put the tail boom on. So when we come back, I'm going to show you how my linkage ended up, how my governor linkage ended up, and how I plumbed the engine. Almost done, guys. Alright guys, it occurred to me that I hadn't shown you the completed tail boom. Here it is. All I did off camera was I installed the tail control rod links. I did size them. We want to make sure there's absolutely no drag on this rod at all. Again, this all goes to a good mechanical setup. I installed that link. I put the boom on. Obviously the torque tube is down inside the boom. These kits do come ready to go to pin the back tail box. I strongly recommend you do that. What I do is put the boom in, clamp it, partially run in this screw to where it scores the boom, pull the boom back out, drill that spot, and then put it back together. I do use Loctite on that bolt since there are threads in the tail box for it. This boom is ready to go on. I will, while I'm doing the flybarless setup, I will have to fine tune the links of these rods to make sure that my bell crank is at 90 when my tail servo is centered. I've got them pretty close. I've built a lot of these tails so I can kind of eyeball them. I'll probably still have to go 2 or 3 turns to get it perfect. And believe me, I will take the time to make it right. I'm going to tell you, if I haven't said it before in this video, I've probably said it 5 times in others. The time spent making sure the tail is mechanically right will save you hours in tuning frustrations. It really will. Of course, it's a nitro, brand new nitro engine. Tail's going to be a little sketch while the engine breaks in and gets tuned, but once the engine is tuned, when I'm ready to really fine tune the tail, I'm going to know mechanically I'm ready to go. I'm going to set this to the side. I'm not going to put that on the helicopter yet because this is the perfect opportunity to go ahead and plumb the engine. What the boom's off fits on the bench a lot better. So I'm going to cut the camera, I'm going to plumb the engine and come back and show you how it worked out. Well, there it is, guys. I got this engine and tank all plumbed up. Let me run you through this real quick. I'm sure most of you are not new to this, but just in case this is one of your first nitro, maybe your first regulated engine, I'll explain a couple of things. There are 2 forms of two different methods to pressurize the fuel tank. The oldest or most trusted method for a very long time was to actually use pressure from the exhaust pipe. And that was plumbed. There was a nipple on the exhaust pipe that would then be plumbed over to the pressure fitting. that would, when the engine was running, exhaust fumes would then be pumped into the tank to help pressurize it. Then that positive pressure would help feed the carburetor. That was problematic. When the tanks were full, they would run rich. When they were empty, they'd run lean. It just wasn't very consistent. Not too sure how long ago it has been, but quite a while now. OS and YS and some other manufacturers have had regulators. And the way the regulator works, it actually takes positive crankcase pressure to pressurize the tank. And then that is pumped, then the fuel is pumped into a regulator that only allows so much fuel in at a time. You have a consistent, accurate, tunable amount of fuel going in the carburetor regardless of the fuel level. I think it's genius. I'm glad that this technology is around now. It makes for a lot easier tuning of engines. But it does change the plumbing a little bit, so let me walk you through it. So you might notice at the bottom of the engine here, there is a fuel nipple there. That's the pressure line. That runs around the bottom into this check valve. The purpose of the check valve is it allows pressure to come this way, but not back. The pressure is created when the piston is on a downstroke. The check valve keeps the downstroke, the upstroke, from sucking the pressure right back out of the tank. The check valves come with the engine. Make sure you check orientation when you install them. I like to blow into one end. You should be able to blow one way and not the other. And then that runs up here through a T into the pressure fitting on the tank. The reason there's a T here is at the end of the flight, the tank's going to be under pressure. You need to pop this cap and release that pressure before you refuel, obviously, but then also to keep, if you leave the tank empty and pressurized, it will damage the grommet long term. So want to make sure you pop that pressure at the end of the flight. The plumbing of the engine is pretty straightforward. There's a fuel line goes into a fuel filter, and that fuel filter goes up into the carburetor. Now, I use these Align 3-way filter tees. That way I don't have a filter and a tee. The reason it needs to be a tee is you need some place to add the fuel. So I've got my fuel goes in here into the tank, and then when this is plugged, the fuel then runs through the filter, through the screen, and up into the carburetor. Pretty straightforward. I know I say that a lot, but Synergy helicopters are pretty straightforward, and OS and YS engines have got the plumbing figured out. It's not hard. There is a diagram on that plumbing in the owner's manual. I strongly suggest you refer to it. Now I'm going to stop the camera and set up my carburetor linkage, and I'll show you what that looks like. Well, there you go, guys. My carburetor linkage is set up. My governor is programmed. The general idea here is that when the servo is at 50% throttle and the carburetor bowl is lined up with the 50% throttle hash, these arms should be parallel. This gives me equal throw both directions. The distance from here to here is equal distance from here to here, so every minute movement of this servo is an equally same size movement of the carburetor bowl. Matt put a lot of effort into researching and laying out in SolidWorks where to mount this throttle servo so that proper resolution was possible, and he did a bang up job. My governor endpoints are exactly 100, 100, and I am bump stop to bump stop and no binding. That's beautiful. The distance here is going to vary slightly depending upon which servo horns you use. The manual does have a guideline. You want to stick to it. My distance to distance measurement is right at 67. That is pretty much all there is left to do on this, guys. I'm going to mount the exhaust pipe. I'm going to put the tail on and set my endpoints for my tail rotor. And this guy's ready to put some fuel in and give it a shot. I will fire it up in the garage without any blades to fine tune the idle and the throttle kill. We'll also let the engine run for a little bit with at idle and start this is a brand new engine, so first run's going to be without blades. Not going to run it up very high RPM, just check to make sure the clutch is engaging properly. Let it idle some, fine tune the idle adjustments, fine tune the throttle kill. And then tomorrow's Saturday, and I've got the kids to myself, and the weather's looking pretty good. I'm going to reward the kids with lunch out to eat, and then we're going to stop at the field and we're going to put some flights on this thing. I'm hoping 4 or 5 flights on this guy tomorrow. Start the break-in process proper. I will post up my findings afterwards, but I'm going to cut the camera, put the tail on, and then I'm going to show you how the canopy mounts work, and this will be about done. Well guys, this is going to be very, very hard to see on the video, but this helicopter is done. I've even actually already done a little pressure test with fuel in the tank. I took it out to my backyard last night and fired it up and let it run some. This helicopter is ready to throw the blades on it and go fly. Now at the end of this video, I'll have some still pictures I took along the way, as well as some finished pictures of the model itself. The only thing really left to do, and I'm going to show you real quick, is how the canopy works out. The canopy is held on a lot like the N7 and 516 canopies. You've got these U-channel, excuse me, let me just cut these open for you. You've got these U-channel mounts that go into the front of the canopy, and then you've got quick release to go in the back. The U-channels are held on with a washer and a M2.5 screw. The Delrin insert Delrin U-channel does have a little key shape oval that lines up to an oval on the canopy so that it holds it square, and the screw holds the insert into the canopy. It's pretty straightforward. Well guys, that's pretty much it. This helicopter is done. We are going to get the blades on it, take it out and do some flying today. And again, you'll see it here in a minute, but for my own mental note, I'm going to take some pictures of it complete to put at the end of the video so you can see everything, because it's really hard to put that helicopter with blades and everything in front of the camera. So thanks for following along. It's been a lot of fun. Any questions, comments, throw them in the comments down here. Shoot me a message. Again, chris.sexton.rc on Facebook, or on Helifreak as Chris Sexton, SynergyRCHelicopters.com forum as Chris Sexton. Send me a message, guys. I'll answer questions as quickly as I can. See you guys soon.